It's Lars. Thank you for checking out my podcast, and have a great day.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I feel so lucky and, frankly, so blessed. I do say my prayers every single night, but I don't know. God has just chosen to smile on me today because I have lots and lots of people that we had already scheduled to talk to, like John Solomon, the founder of Just the News, the perfect man to talk to when it comes to the day when just less than 2.5 hours ago we got news that broke, I think, much to the surprise of just about everybody, that a Manhattan grand jury has decided to indict Donald Trump. The charges seem to, I think, are almost guaranteed to be connected to the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement monies that were paid to Stormy Daniels, otherwise known as Stephanie Clifford. John, welcome back to the program. You are one of the perfect people to talk to about this because you have a very good relationship with Donald Trump, and you know this story frontwards and back. So welcome back, and where should we start?
Yeah, well, listen, let's just acknowledge where we are. We are in an unprecedented moment. We're in uncharted legal and political waters for any time in our American history. No former or current president's ever been charged. And what we do know is that today, President Trump's lawyers were notified by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, a man who campaigned to get the job by saying, I'm going to be the guy that takes out Donald Trump. They were notified that an indictment was handed up by the grand jury. We don't know the charges, and we may not know the specific charges until the grand jury indictment is unsealed at arraignment. But a notification occurred, and it does, the lawyers were told it does involve the payment to porn actress Stormy Daniels 7 years ago. So that is the state of play. From the left to the right, this news has been condemned. Just a few minutes ago, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said that this is an abuse of power. It's an unlawful interference in the election system, and that his House of Representatives will hold Alvin Bragg to account. Alan Dershowitz, liberal Harvard Law professor who voted for Joe Biden, he's an open Joe Biden supporter, said the worst legal and prosecutorial decision he's seen in his illustrious 63-year career as a lawyer. And President Trump himself just put out a statement condemning all of this. So we know the state of play. We don't know the actual information underlying the indictment, but we do know America is headed into a new moment of political turmoil.
Well, I'll tell you this, John. I know that Ron DeSantis, governor of New York, also seeking the Republican nomination for president. So a competitor of Donald Trump has condemned this as the politicization of the process. But he's also said, I won't cooperate in extradition. I don't know that that's going to be an issue because I'd ask you, you know Trump well. You hold a special place in Donald Trump's world, especially when it comes to the archives and things like that. Tell me this. What's the best play for him? Should he just quietly walk in and say, have his attorney say, our client will surrender himself on such and such a date, or what?
Yeah, this news broke in the middle of my TV show, and so we were very lucky to get Liz Harrington on the show, the national spokeswoman for President Trump. She says that the current plan, that's the word she used, the current plan is for the president to surrender and to fight the charges. He's not going to create an extradition situation. He's going to fight the charges. He believes he's innocent, and he will continue to campaign. He will not suspend his campaign. He is going to fight these charges. And so we know the current state is that. That's the current news out of the presidential campaign, out of the presidential office, 45th president's office. So that's the current state of play. I think you noted something really interesting, Ron DeSantis saying, I'm not going to extradite this guy. It just shows you the extraordinary impunity that even people who would like to beat Donald Trump at the election box feel about what Alvin Bragg has done.
Well, let me ask you about this. From the other side, in the next couple of days, what should we expect to hear? Because if Democrats come out and say, I'm glad he's been indicted, on a skinny case, you mentioned 7 years. Well, the statute of limitations on the state statute, the falsification of business records, is 2 years, long since run, and applying to a company that's in New York. And then the federal statute, I believe, had a 5-year statute of limitations. So all of that has run out. And Bragg, to my knowledge, has absolutely, positively no legal authority to prosecute the federal case in any case. So Do the Democrats come out and say, yeah, this is exactly what should happen? Or are they going to try to nuance it and sort of thread the needle and find a way not to fully approve of political charges against a political opponent, but at the same time say, yeah, Trump deserves it?
It's unclear to me what the Democrats are doing, because I don't think the Democrats know what the actual theory of the case is. We've seen what's been leaked, but we don't know. Is this a false statements case? Is there some obstruction charge? We don't know. I think the Democrats will hold their powder and encourage Americans to wait and see what the indictment is. When the indictment comes out, I think you'll see a lot of Democrats react one way or the other. If it's some unexpected revelation that we didn't know about Donald Trump or his behavior, I think the Democrats will double down. If it is the case that you just described and what has been really been debated for the last many weeks, I think a lot of Democrats are going to express concern and maybe suggest that this is an issue better settled at the ballot box. And I think one other thing to watch, and that is that the judicial system is going to get a crack at this. There are judges, appellate judges, the New York Supreme Court, and then the federal judiciary will also weigh in. This is going to go up and down the court system. Judges could also get involved and rule one way or the other against Alvin Bragg. So a lot of history is going to happen. I think Democrats hold their power till they see what the facts are.
Okay, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, when Alvin Bragg said, I'm going to take him out, he can run under indictment. He can run if he's convicted, can't he?
That's right.
So
yes,
how does this take him out?
There have been presidential candidates in the past who run for office while in prison. Lyndon LaRouche is someone who used to run, though he had been indicted and imprisoned. This will not disqualify President Trump from holding office unless there's some crime that meets the constitutional definition for disqualification, which right now no one has suggested that. So, yeah, President Trump's going to run, and a lot of people think this is going to strengthen his hand as creating sort of a persecution complex for American voters to say, you know what, I don't like this, and my best way of reacting against this, even if I don't like Donald Trump, is voting for him to defy the system. I think that's a dynamic some of the people on the president are counting on.
Well, John, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I don't know if you share, but I've already told my audience, I think political prosecution of political opponents is a thing for third world banana republics and communist dictatorships. It's not what America wants. And second, over the last couple of years, we saw a lot of average Americans who run a little business somewhere told, shut your business down because of the pandemic. And when they said no, the state, the authorities came after them hammer and tong. And I think a lot of people are going to see Donald Trump's case as resonating with the same things that were done to them or done to their friends. And they didn't like it. They don't want to be in an America where you say, if you don't do what your government betters tell you to do, then we'll come after you with every tool in the toolbox. I think that's just evil. John, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Great honor to be with you.
Thank you, sir. That's John Solomon, the founder of Just the News. Always glad that you listen to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to vote in our Twitter poll, at Lars Larson Show, or at our website, larslarson.com, if you want to weigh in on the conversation, it's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. And naysayers always go to the head of the line on the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. You know that from the beginning of the pandemic, now more than 3 years ago, we got all kinds of conflicting information, much of it shoveled out by the United States government, some of it shoveled out by the private sector. And of course, we also had some people in the government that were steering information using social media, I think much to the disadvantage of the average citizen. But now, should some states say we distrust the use of mRNA vaccine technology enough to actually say we're going to ban its use? I thought we'd put that question to Dr. Henry Miller, who's a doctor, molecular biologist, and the Glenn Swager Distinguished Fellow at the American Council on Science and Health, founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology. Dr. Miller, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Lars. Thank you.
So I take it you're not a fan of this idea that's been introduced by two state lawmakers in Idaho who've said if you decide to use mRNA technology on people in our state, that will be a criminal act.
To say that I'm not a fan is the understatement of this century. It's like trying to legislate a ban on insulin or on treatments for migraine headaches or for morphine. It's just preposterous. It makes no sense whatsoever, and it's an imminent hazard to the public.
But it shows a level of distrust for some of the technology that we had pushed on us by the government, still being pushed on us by the government, and then the government compounded that by not telling us what they actually knew about this. Does that change the picture a bit?
Well, it depends what part of the picture you look at, I think, Lars. So, for example, the government, at least in many, many jurisdictions in this country, say that kids have to have certain vaccines before they can go to school. And to serve in the armed forces, you have to have another set of vaccines and adhere to certain health diagnostic tests and treatments and preventatives. So the government dictates many aspects of public health, from entering public school and on into adulthood. So I'm not against that in principle, but there is a point at which we need to be permitted to make our own choices about those things.
Okay, but let me try a question on you. I've talked to Dr. Robert Malone, not many times, but and I've read a lot of what the guy has had to say, and he's the one who's, I guess, at least largely responsible for creating the mRNA technology. I know there were lots and lots of other people, but he was one of the focal points for creating that. He said, has this ever been used to create a vaccine for use in humans?
You mean before
COVID? Yep.
Before the COVID? No. But remember that all of the approved vaccines were tested in 30,000 plus individuals in randomized controlled tests, and the results evaluated for safety and efficacy before they were permitted.
Except that weren't some of the results kept from the public that we found out later, saying, "Oh, you didn't tell us that you knew about some of these flaws," and we've seen the emails and other communications among the medical field saying, well, we can't tell the public all these things because then it will work against the idea of getting people to take the vaccine. In other words, the government many of the people within the government seemed to be really concerned about making sure people would take this by banning them from taking anything else, by not even investigating other avenues, and then saying, this is the thing, it's really good, and holding back information on some of the flaws that had emerged in that testing.
I'm not aware of any data that was withheld. There were some side effects that became evident only when even larger numbers of patients were treated. So, for example, if you have a side effect that occurs in 1 in 10 million or 1 in a million even, you're not going to see it or see it reliably in a test on 30,000.
No, I wouldn't expect that you would, but what about side effects like myocarditis? What about side effects like some strokes that happen? And they were happening not 1 in 10 million, were they?
Well, that was difficult to ascertain because strokes are much more common after COVID itself. And so in clinical trials where you have people contracting COVID infections, you're going to see strokes. So again, I read the materials that were presented to the FDA's advisory committee very carefully on the tens of thousands of patients. And I'm not aware that there was anything there that was, well, I can't tell what was withheld, but there wasn't anything that was frequent enough that it should have been evident in those briefing materials that came out subsequently. Myocarditis, very rare, resolves, and again, is less frequent after vaccination than it is after COVID. And because the vaccines are effective, the net benefit of the vaccines is palpable.
Do you think that the government was entirely honest when it talked about the possibility of actually dying from the vaccine, as some people did? And as you recall, you and I talked about it. There was a young lady from Seattle who died, and she died of thrombocytic cytopenia, I think is what you call it. And she took the vaccine over her protest. She said she didn't want it, but she wanted to be able to help out in her kid's school. They said, if you want to help, you got to take the vaccine. She was young, she was healthy, she died. Now, do you think the American public got the straight story
on what the possibilities were of getting killed by the vaccine?
I don't think we know that the vaccine was the cause of her thrombocytopenia.
That's
And
what
I
her
can
doctor put on the death certificate.
Well, I can tell you stories about what's called the post-hoc ergopropter hoc, that is, after the fact, therefore because of the fact fallacy. I was once giving, when I was an intern, middle of the night, the 4 a.m. dose, giving a cancer drug. I was having trouble getting the bubbles out of the syringe, and I'm flicking the syringe to get the bubbles out. It's 2 minutes past 4 a.m. Just before I gave the patient the drug, she rolled over and died. Now, if I had given the drug at exactly 4 a.m., she would have died immediately after I had pushed it into her IV.
I can see that example, but the other problem with that is we heard after the fact, oh, by the way, a whole bunch of the cases that were labeled as COVID were exactly the same kind of arrangement. Somebody gets in an automobile accident, they do have COVID, it's in their system, but the auto accident killed them. But the hospital, for financial reasons, may have labeled it a COVID death because COVID deaths are worth a whole lot more to the hospital than a car accident death. And so that same phenomena played out with dollars attached to it during COVID, didn't it?
That probably did happen. But, individuals' chicanery is a fact of life, and I deplore it. It's dishonest. They should be held accountable. But that doesn't really have anything to do with the value of the vaccines and this irrational resistance to them in some quarters.
Yeah, I understand why I'm skeptical of it. As you know, I haven't taken the vaccine. I didn't take the jab, and I've had COVID, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily the right way. I don't think I decide the right way. I think I decide for me. I think everybody else decides for them. But I know an awful lot of government agencies were paying people cash to take a shot. Now, doctor, should we ever be suspicious when a government agency says, we really want you to take this shot and we really think it'll be good for you and we'll pay you cash to take it? Shouldn't that alone make you a bit suspicious?
One person could call it suspicious. Another could call it a way to get people to protect public health.
To do something they wouldn't do on their own unless they're offered some cash. Doctor, I think there's some serious problems with the way the government behaved and the way healthcare behaved during all that. That's Dr. Henry Miller. He's with the American Council on Science and Health, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. These days, you don't have to work hard or look far to find concerns about race. Race is attributed to just about everything in our society today, especially by people on the left. Now, those of us on the right would like to be colorblind, but we're told that, well, if you're colorblind, then you're not sufficiently anti-racist. You know, that kind of language. That's where you get CRT. It's where you get diversity, equity, and inclusion. You get a lot of the crazier policies that are being pushed on us from the left side of the aisle. So I wanted to ask this question of Giancarlo Canaparo, who's a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Giancarlo, welcome to the program. And is there a case to be made that the left's push to make everything in America about race, is that putting people in danger?
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me. Well, as I've written recently in at least one instance, the answer is yes. You may be familiar with, you may remember Francis Collins. He was Anthony Fauci's boss. He retired last year. And one of the last things he did before retiring as director of the National Institutes of Health was to pressure Moderna, the pharmaceutical company that made one of our vaccines, into delaying the release of its COVID vaccine because he wanted more minorities in its clinical trials. Now, the problem with what he did is that is not scientific and it's not medical. And the reason for that is that the racial classifications that we use in America, black, Asian, white, Hispanic, they're not scientific at all. In fact, they're not even biological. Asian, Indian, white, these are all determined under law according to geography, the geography of your ancestors. Yep. Indian, for instance, American Indian is purely cultural. The only one of these that is actually biologically related to anything is black. But as any scientist will tell you, Black just means, under American law, anyone who comes from one of the black tribes of Africa. But as any biologist will tell you, there's more genetic diversity between the various black groups in Africa than there is between me as a white person and any of the black tribes of Africa. So to use minority or to use America's race labels to delay the production of a vaccine was completely unscientific. And to the extent that the vaccines were helpful in dealing with COVID or reducing symptoms, dangerous.
Now, I may say his name wrong, but Stefan Bancel, the CEO of Moderna, he actually took the suggestion from Francis Collins seriously. He said, and you quoted him, diversity matters more to us than speed. So having the right number of people of color in a sample of patients, he said, was more important to him than getting something done. I have my own view on the vaccine, and I've discussed it plenty on the show. But to the extent that there was an urgency about getting the vaccine, when a pharmaceutical company says, "Oh, we have to show greater diversity," even when it has absolutely no impact on the outcome of the scientific studies, because they want to look as though we've had a sample that actually was racially diverse. That's scary.
Right. I mean, and you look at this. When he says we want diversity matters more to speed. Diversity of what? Not diversity of biologics, not diversity of genetics, not diversity of anything that might interact with a particular medicine or a particular vaccine. Just color, just skin color. That's it. And that obsession with skin color is enough for them to delay this medical trial. And it's not just vaccines, mind you. The Food and Drug Administration under Biden has now pressured companies making any kinds of medicines to make sure that their medical trials are racially diverse. But of course, the racial diversity they want has zero bearing whatsoever on the science of medicine.
Are any of the scientists within those agencies? Because I would guess that within Moderna, at least on the testing side of it, on the development side of it, you're wall-to-wall scientists there. And at NIH, other than people who are, say, clerical workers or janitors, most of the people there are scientists. Are any of the scientists pushing back against this, saying, hey, boss, this doesn't matter to what the research shows?
As far as I know, I haven't found any. But it's actually worse than that. You have people like there's a Harvard Medical School professor, Farah Mateen, who wrote in a medical research paper research paper is a strong word, but she wrote in a paper in 2021. She said, yes, I know that race is a social construct. Yes, I know that race is a poorly defined marker of genetic diversity. And yes, I know that race is an imprecise proxy for the relationship between genetics and medicine. But we still need to use skin color quotas in medical trials to advance health equity. So she's a scientist. She's a Harvard Med School professor. She knows this is nonsense, and she's so beholden to political partisanship and this race obsession that she'll do it anyway.
Well, but does she, when she says we have to do this, does she say why? Because as a reporter, that would be my next question. Why do you have to do this if it doesn't have a scientific reason?
Yep. Her answer is health equity. Which is a nice way of saying we need to balance the various health outcomes between our arbitrary American racial classifications.
Well, except that when you say outcomes, it'd be one thing if they said, if we only test or predominantly test this on white people, that it might actually harm people of color, or it might fail to do them the good that we're trying to get from the drug or the shot or whatever. That'd be one thing. But when they're saying scientifically, whether we test this on all people of color or no people of color or a mixture or one that mirrors the rainbow of American society, it won't matter. You say, okay, but we still have to do it. What's the why?
The why, I mean, I wish I could give you a satisfying answer, but the why is health equity. And again, that just means, if there are disparities between our arbitrarily created racial groups in America, the government has to come in and eliminate those disparities by government fiat.
But will they be, sorry to interrupt, but will they be, Giancarlo, eliminated by simply including more people of color in a drug trial, for example.
No, and that's the incredibly frustrating thing. They will not if what you're actually looking at is actual health differences. But if all you actually care about is the number of people of one skin color or another in a medical trial, then yes. But if that's all you care about, why on earth do you care about that? It's meaningless. But ultimately, that's what these people care about. They care about this virtue signaling about skin color. They don't care about the science of medicine.
By the way, I mean, that there are only a few that a lay person like me would know about from medicine. But do they demand the same kind of diversity in, say, a clinical trial about sickle cell anemia or Tay-Sachs? Tay-Sachs is predominantly Jewish people. Sickle cell anemia is predominantly Black Americans. Do they say, oh, well, our survey, if 70% of America is white, we need to have 70% test subjects in our study on a new drug for sickle cell anemia or a new treatment for that? Because that's where it gets ridiculous. Or testing new maternity methods where you have to have at least 49% men because that's what we are in the population.
Well, I mean, I laugh, but since men and women doesn't mean man and woman anymore, we will. I guarantee you that the federal government's next step is to start demanding data about sex and trans people in medical trials.
We're going to go to Procter & Gamble and say, did you have a sufficient number of biological males in your test of the new feminine hygiene product? And I assume they'll say, what, are you crazy? I would hope we get some sanity back in this. Giancarlo, thanks a lot. That's Giancarlo Canaparo, who's a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Glad to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Emails go to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show. Coming up on the Radio Northwest Network, we got to talk about the Oregon Department of Transportation and its plans for an $8 toll, and the Department of Revenue and the legislature and their plans for a bigger income tax. You're listening to the Radio Northwest Network.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you and a real pleasure to be at the Hoover Broadcast Studios on the Stanford campus. We get to talk to some smart people. And one of the questions I want to put to our friend Leo Hanian, who's one of the senior fellows at the Hoover Institution, professor of economics and director of the Ettinger Family Program in macroeconomics research at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, is about housing. Lee, welcome back to the program, by the way.
Thanks, Lars. Happy to join you.
I got to tell you something. I know almost nothing about sports. So asking me to run a sports team would be like asking Governor Gavin Newsom to do something about housing. I'm convinced that people like Newsom, the governor of California, and other governors and other government officials know nothing about how to create housing, how to manage housing, how to do almost anything to do with housing, and yet all of them seem to want to jump into it with both feet and say we're short of housing, mostly because of things government has done, so now government is going to come and help you solve the problem, and Gavin Newsom has been promising exactly that, hasn't he?
Yeah, Lars, I would say you would do, no matter how little you know about running a sports team, I can almost guarantee you would do a better job running that sports team than Governor Newsom has performed in terms of California housing. Newsom, when he ran for governor first time in 2018, increasing housing, reducing homelessness, improving housing affordability was his primary campaign promise. And right now, his goal, the actual housing numbers relative to his goal, he is 87% below his goal, below his target.
Wow.
87%. It is shocking just how badly housing is performing here. And when you look at the historical housing starts, new construction in the state, just the needle hasn't moved whatsoever within the state, despite the fact that Newsom has spent over $22 billion since taking office. Nothing has changed, despite $22 billion of taxpayers' money being spent on this.
Hold on, $22 billion. If he's achieved 13% of his goal, I think I've done the math right there. As they say, I didn't finish college. So he's built maybe 500,000 homes with $22 billion. what exactly is he doing with the money? Is he just driving by housing developments and throwing the money out the window, or what? No, I mean,
Yes.
I'm trying to imagine what they do with $22 billion to waste it that thoroughly.
Yeah. Your jocular analogy is not too far from the truth. So where has that $22 billion gone? Well, it's gone into what people refer to as affordable housing, but there's no such thing as affordable housing in California.
No
Affordable
kidding.
housing projects are run by the government. And here's how much money is being spent. It is costing Californians nearly, and in some cases more than $1 million to house one person.
Wow.
So that $22 billion doesn't go all that far when you think about spending $1 million to house one person. And
So
it
what do
is
they do?
literally analogous to just throwing money out the window. Taxpayers' dollars are going into, if you remember the old Tom Hanks film, The Money Pit, it is literally a state-level money pit.
Well, and here's the thing. When they changed it from public housing, which everybody if you walk down the street and just stop somebody here in Palo Alto and said, hey, when I say public housing, tell me the picture it draws in your mind. You know, if they went along with you and said, okay, I'll tell you exactly what I think of, it would not be pretty. Because public housing is not thought of well anywhere in America. I don't know. There may be a project or two that actually is run well and, put together well and all that. But most as soon as you say public housing, it's like, okay, that's awful, degraded, waste of money, is going to have to be fixed up soon, probably has a problematic population living in it to some extent. So you give me your prescription. I'd like to know what you would do to fix. I've got some ideas, but I'm not heading up the Ettinger program either. So what should he be doing, or what could he be doing with $22 billion or more to spend on this kind of problem?
Well, obviously, the money could go much farther than it is right now. And just to give you an example, the state of California is spending more on a per square foot basis on housing than Prince Harry and Meghan Markle spent on their Montecito estate, which is perhaps the most expensive zip code in California, roughly twice as much per square foot as the Royals spent on their 5-acre estate in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. So the first thing is to just get government out of the process of building housing. They've just failed abysmally at that. That's number one. The second is to reduce building regulations, which means reforming California's antiquated Environmental Quality Act. And Newsom has railed about this act when it doesn't work according to what he wants, but he could change it with an executive order. He could change that with a supermajority in the state legislature. He's been in office now over 4 years. That antiquated Environmental Act remains. So that would just do enormous wonders for allowing builders to be able to build at a much lower cost. The California Environmental Quality Act has really been weaponized to fight development, and it raises costs enormously.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Let me throw an idea at you. At least in my neck of the woods, one of the biggest problems is what they call system development charges. Now, there are all kinds of different names for them, but near where I live, if you wanted to build a house, you have to buy the land. That's expensive. Then you pay the government around $100,000 to build a single house, and that's just paperwork. It's paperwork and permits and system development charges and all that. I'm guessing California does the same kind of nonsense. Am I right?
Absolutely. The city of Fremont, which is close to Silicon Valley, not so far from where you are right now, you're on the campus of Stanford. The city of Fremont is a great example of that. They charge $150,000, sometimes close to $200,000 for a home to be built. And this is really, it's equivalent to highway robbery. It's just a way of getting money into the coffers of local government. And this is something that needs to change as well.
Well, how about this idea? What if Gavin Newsom said, on the next billion I spend, I've already spent 22, didn't get much done for it. On the next billion, I'm going to offer to every developer who wants to build it, and you could even put some caps on it so it's not all just really expensive millionaire houses. Fine. You say, okay, zero, if you start your project now and you promise to get it done within a period of time, zero SDC. The 150 will be paid out of that fund. So then the state is incentivizing the creation of $500,000, $750,000 houses or apartment units or whatever by only paying the SDCs. If they forgave the SDCs and did that, do you think a lot of developers would say, "Hey, you sign us up. We're going to do that"?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I speak regularly with a number of major developers in the state, and they're just pulling out their hair over the amount they have to spend on building for really silly things. There's a whole laundry list of regulations and red tape that they have to go through. So, yeah, that's a great idea.
That's my contribution for now. That's Leo Hanian. He's here at the Hoover Institution as a senior fellow and also director of the Ettinger Family Program on Macroeconomics at UCLA. Professor, thank you for the time. We'll be back in a moment. You got the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your phone calls. I want to ask you something, and this is not just a theoretical question. If you go to see a doctor, and most of us have to go to see the doctor from time to time, would you like that doctor to have been granted a spot in medical school based on his or her qualifications, or would you rather have the medical school decide who gets into medical school, who becomes a doctor, or at least has the opportunity to become a doctor based on skin color or something other than their actual qualifications? Now, while you're considering that, if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here, daily, at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line. That's been true for more than 26 years. And if you want to answer our Twitter poll, you'll find it a couple of places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and larslarson.com on the web. Frankly, I have had doctors who are male, doctors who are female over the years, doctors who are people of color, doctors who are white. I don't really care. I want a qualified doctor. I want a qualified PA. I don't care about their skin color, where they go to church, or anything else. I care about whether or not they're qualified. I want you to consider this headline, because an awful lot of the mainstream media is not spending a lot of time on this story. And then I'll give you a specific example of where affirmative action in medicine is literally deadly. But first, this is the flash. Medical schools are continuing to drop the MCAT in favor of what they call alternative routes to become a doctor. Well, what does that mean? Well, the MCAT is the Medical College Admissions Test. It's a bit like there are tests if you want to go to law school. There are tests if you just want to go to an ordinary college, like the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And a lot of the colleges are being pressured to have what they call a diverse group of students. And by that, they mean it's a euphemism, where what they mean is we want more people of color. Depending on the kind of school you're seeking, they may want more women or more men, either way. And they say we can't get there if we do it based on the qualifications that somebody shows when they take the MCAT. When you sit down and take the test that shows whether or not you have sufficient knowledge of all kinds of subjects, biology, chemistry, math, a whole bunch of other things that you should know to be a doctor. Now, it doesn't guarantee that you'll end up a doctor. It doesn't guarantee you'll end up a good doctor. We've all had good doctors and sometimes some that leave something to be desired. Here's the way it's described by the Daily Caller: dropping the MCAT in favor of what they call holistic admissions practices. Now, what does that mean? It's say we take a look at the entire student and we try to decide based on not just how they do on tests of their knowledge and their abilities to understand. We're going to look at a bunch of other things. Well, I don't think that's a good idea. And let me give you a specific example. And it goes back quite a ways. There was a Supreme Court decision not quite 50 years ago, not Roe v. Wade, the Bakke decision. And over the years, I've followed this, and one of the guys who's done the best reporting on this is Jeff Jacoby at the Boston Globe. He is a conservative, but he's also a guy who just focuses on the facts. The Bakke decision, when I was first getting into the news business, was a famous decision. Bakke, a guy named Alan Bakke, who is in fact today still a medical doctor in Minnesota, and a good one by all accounts. He got pushed aside for a student whose name, well, his actual name was Patrick Chavez, but he later went by Bernard Chavez, and he was pushed aside. And he said, look, I had better test scores. I'm better qualified academically to be in medical school. But they pushed him to the side and they allowed Patrick Chavez into medical school, even though he had lower academic standards and he couldn't perform as well academically. And as Jacoby points out, the result is that for black students for 20 years has been failing the national medical boards. They point out that a study by JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, says 88% of white students pass the exam. Now, these are people who want to become doctors. You wouldn't be taking the MCATs otherwise. 49% of black students do. And you say, well, that means that they're coming to the test not as well qualified. So what happens with Alan Bakke? As I said, he's still a doctor today. He's an anesthesiologist. And Dr. Bernard Chavez, who at the time called himself Patrick Chavez. Well, Patrick Chavez got into medical school, and then he graduated. And you know, people as notable as, and I didn't like him much at all, but the late Senator Ted Kennedy, the Lion of the Senate, as the Democrats wanted to call him, he actually gave this quote back in the night. He said, Dr. Bernard Chavez is a perfect example. He is the supposedly less qualified African-American student who allegedly displaced Alan Bakke at the University of California, Davis, UC Davis, and triggered the landmark case. So the Supreme Court said, yep, you're right. We have to let Bernard Chavez, Patrick Chavez, into medical school, and Alan Bakke, he gets pushed to the side. Well, he just went to a different medical school, and he got in anyway. And what Kennedy said about 20 years ago, he said, today Dr. Chavez is a successful OBGYN in central Los Angeles, serving a disadvantaged community and making a difference in the lives of poor people. Now, there's actually a little bit more to the story than that. Dr. Chavez actually had his medical license suspended, period, because the medical board in California said his inability to perform some of the most basic duties required of a physician. He couldn't do his job. An administrative law judge found Chavez guilty of gross negligence and incompetence in the treatment of 3 patients, one of whom died at his hands. And was he doing important care for poorer people in poorer communities? No, he went out and took a 4-day course in liposuction. You know, this is where they stick an instrument into your body and they suck the fat out. It's cosmetic surgery, or it's a cosmetic treatment to make you look not as fat because it takes the fat out, except that it can go horribly, horribly wrong. And in at least one of the cases that Jacoby documented was a woman who went in, had the liposuction done. She was in really bad shape medically. She was bleeding. She was in distress. Did Dr. Chavez take her down to the hospital to get some emergency treatment to save her life? No, he took her back to his house, a patient, and parked her at her house. She managed to survive that. Some of his patients did not. And I would suggest that the fact that today they're still talking about lowering the academic standards for doctors, saying we need to get more doctors not based on their qualifications, but based on whether or not they fill out the certain checked boxes that people want. We want so many people of color, so many people who are gay, so many people who are this, that, or the other thing. This comes back to you and me, because it may be that when you walk into a doctor's office, you don't have any way of knowing whether that doctor got into medical school because he or she was really smart and really knew the subject matter necessary to be a good doctor, or whether they got in based on race, gender, or somebody's idea of diversity. And if they got in for that reason, you might get lucky or you might end up dead. That's the bottom line. Glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Send emails to talk@larslarson.com. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Coming up next, we'll talk about Chicago's crime problem. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on what we like to call Conspiracy Theory Thursday. I want you to consider that just like his stance on Israel and Taiwan, Joe Biden loves to say one thing, only to have his administration, everybody else that works for him, walk it back. But have all those walkbacks and apologies caused Americans to lose faith in Joe Biden's foreign policy? That is, I guess, of course, considering whether they had faith in it to begin with or not, given that even some of his associates from the Obama years said Joe Biden has got every single position he's ever taken on foreign policy wrong. I thought I'd talk about that with Annelle Sheline, who is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ms. Sheline, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So are these walkbacks costing the White House any kind of credibility it ever had?
Well, what's been interesting, at least what I've been working on, is the pressure the White House put on Bernie Sanders to withdraw his Yemen War Powers Resolution. That vote was supposed to come to the floor on Tuesday, and at the last minute, Sanders said he'd gotten an assurance from the White House that they were going to work on something mutually agreeable so that the U.S. would stop supporting Saudi Arabia in this war. Part of what's surprising about this is after we saw Saudi Arabia cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day in October, Biden said he wanted to rethink the U.S.-Saudi relationship and he wanted Congress to take the lead. And so this would have been Congress taking the lead. This would have been a war powers resolution to reassert congressional war-making authority. And the Biden administration issued pretty strong statements against it, reached out to Congress, reached out both publicly and privately to say they were opposed. And so Sanders ended up temporarily withdrawing. He said he'll reintroduce it later, but it's going to be under the new Congress and it's going to be more difficult.
I want to ask you this, though. Administrations, they have a certain amount of information they've got to hold back about where they're going. I wouldn't expect them to tell the rest of the world where we're headed. But if you don't communicate some kind of message, overall message, this is the direction our administration is going, don't you run the risk that nobody trusts you if they don't have any idea what you plan to do, and if you're constantly making changes in course that nobody anticipates?
Definitely. I mean, I think we've seen the Biden administration stick to a pretty typical playbook, just as far as the efforts to, again, try to project American power abroad. We've seen them just continuing to maintain a lot of this really aggressive rhetoric towards China, something that the Trump administration started, which personally I just don't think is helpful. We really need to find ways to partner with China on important issues like pandemics and economic development, and especially on climate change. So I don't really see really that much of a difference from administration to administration. A lot of it is just sort of this notion that American primacy is the way to go, or that we're seeing one of the largest military budgets we've ever seen since some of the record-breaking budgets that were necessarily in place during times like World War II, for example. But the U.S. is not currently fighting any major wars abroad. Obviously involved in supporting.
Well, we're sending a lot of hardware to Ukraine, aren't we?
We certainly are, but we're not fighting a war the way we were in Iraq or Afghanistan, and yet still we're getting massive Pentagon budgets, even above what Biden himself requested. Congress has now approved even more money, and more than half of that is going to go to private contractors and not even to the service members themselves. A report just came out that actually many military families struggle to even put food on the table, and so even though we have these massive bloated Pentagon budgets, not actually going to support our service members. Most of it is going to massive military companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, the other big five weapons contractors. Who price gouge and charge far beyond what many of their services are actually worth, but they've created a monopoly and they're able to charge what they want, and the Pentagon just keeps going along with it.
See, I'm kind of curious about that, though, because you've had Iraq, you've had Afghanistan, and my understanding is we've diminished an awful lot of the hardware and the equipment that we have by those actions. We left billions of dollars worth of gear behind in Afghanistan. That had to hurt. Now we're sending a lot of hardware, a lot of money as well to Ukraine. That you've got to replenish all those stores, don't you, if America is going to be prepared for whatever might come, which could be a conflict with China over Taiwan. Shouldn't we have to spend a lot of money with private contractors because they're the ones who build the bombs and the bullets?
No, I mean, I really disagree. And if people are interested, I would direct them towards my colleague, Bill Hartung's work, who's much more of an expert on this. My focus is the Middle East, whereas Bill can get into much more on the sort of broader question of military spending and China and Ukraine. So recommend you speak with him, Lars, next time.
Okay, I'm glad to do that.
But
Anel, let me ask you then about the Middle East. I don't even get a sense of a coherent policy there. Biden comes in after Trump. Trump had the Abraham Accords, which had the promise, we were told in the fall of 20, fall of 20, in the 2020 election year, we had the promise of 4 or 5 more deals in the Middle East that might have brought, some additional movement forward on things that hadn't moved in many ways in decades, and that appears to be out the door or kicked to the curb. What is the Middle East policy of the Joe Biden administration?
I mean, like I was saying, it is kind of a continuity of many of his predecessors, essentially prioritizing relationships such as with Saudi Arabia, even though, as you said, Biden has really switched on that. He was on the campaign trail really saying things like we need to treat the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, responsible
as the
for
prize
the
that they
murder of
are.
Khashoggi. Exactly, the prize that they are. And then instead we see him traveling to Saudi Arabia over the summer, that infamous fist bump, and it didn't pay off at all. As I mentioned, the OPEC Plus cuts, which reflect, Saudi and Russian efforts to keep the price of oil high, which is hurting, efforts to sanction Russia over what Russia is doing to Ukraine. I think many of these countries that we consider partners in the Middle East, whether it's the Saudis or the Israelis or the Emiratis, I mean, they see the way the wind is blowing. They see that now we're in a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the hegemonic force that it once was, and they're hedging. So they're building relationships with China. We just saw President Xi spend several days in Saudi Arabia. China is Saudi Arabia's most important customer, the biggest consumer of Saudi oil and gas. And, China is a massive consumer for other Middle Eastern partners as well. So, unfortunately, the U.S. has sort of ceded much of the economic ground to China, and instead we just try to maintain this relationship on the basis of weapons sales. But then as far as that goes, we're sort of dependent on these countries now because, again, our whole political process is so in the thrall of these massive weapons producers that the thought that we might lose one of our most important customers, the Saudis, remain our most important customer of big weapons purchases, means that our policymaking is completely captured by them and their interests, such that, again, to go back to the war in Yemen, we continue to support what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemen, which is in many ways quite similar to what Russia is doing to Ukraine, this devastating war on civilians in the territory of their, weak and impoverished neighbor, with horrific effects on the innocent people living there. So on the one hand, the U.S. is helping Ukraine, but we're doing the exact opposite by helping the Saudis with what they're doing to Yemen.
Well, Anel, I got to tell you this. I always tell my audience, I'm trying to be as charitable as I can to the Biden administration. If they didn't have double standards, they'd probably have no standards at all. So I guess we have to just assume they're going to do things that are, contradictory. They're going to do things that don't make any sense from the outside or even from the inside. And I guess that's just what we got with allegedly 81 million votes. That's Anel Sheline, who is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ms. Sheline, thanks very much. I appreciate the time. Coming up in a moment, a former U.S. Marine pilot, Daniel Edmund Duggan, allegedly tried to acquire carrier jets for China, and he's now been arrested in Australia. I'll tell you about the story, and we'll give full and lavish credit to the folks behind the story. This is crazy. A former United States Marine Corps officer who's now trying to help China put airplanes on the decks of its aircraft carriers. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to get your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. There are some ideas out there these days that sound pretty good on their face, but you have to know the code words behind them. I mean, if somebody said to you, should we teach kids how to sort out real information from misinformation? on its face, sounds like a pretty decent idea. But when you understand the code words that are being used, maybe it's not such a good idea at all. And Ben Weingarten has written about this for Real Clear Investigations. Ben joins me now. Ben, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Lars. Always a pleasure.
Should people be worried when their schools say, we're going to teach your kids about misinformation?
Well, as you know, on its face, this all sounds great. Teaching kids how to critically think, to interrogate content and look at who is behind the content, who's funding it, what the slant is, who the people are that are interviewed in connection with it, et cetera. But when you dig a little bit deeper on media literacy education, which is being promoted in a growing number of states now, you see that not only is there oftentimes a progressive or hyper-political and a left-leaning direction tinge to it in the way of the academics and the politicians who are promoting this pedagogy, but if you actually look at the roots of media literacy education itself, what you find is that organizations behind it present themselves as nonpartisan and neutral, but if you actually dig deeper in their material, it turns out it has a hugely progressive tinge, if not a Marxian tinge. In fact, when you look into media literacy, which is supposed to be about, like you said, separating fact from fiction and misinformation and the like, there's actually a discipline called critical media literacy, and it is literally critical race theory applied to looking at media. And that is promoted by most of these organizations who are behind the media literacy push, and consequently many of the scholars who I spoke with for this report say that it's a Trojan horse for progressivism.
Yeah, and in fact, Ben, let me throw an example at you that I use all the time. People say, well, we have to fix the justice system in America because we arrest too many people of color. And I say, well, hold on. The worst crime in America is murder. What percentage of murders are committed by people of color? And the answer is about 50%. And you say, well, what percentage in black Americans predominantly and mostly male black Americans? You say, well, what percentage of America is made up of black male Americans? And that'd be 6.5% or so. You say, well, if we're arresting 6.5% of the population 50% of the time for murder, that must mean that the system is biased against people of color. You say, or it means that 50% of the murders in America are committed by one small demographic, 6.5%. You can look at it either way. But I'm reasonably sure the left-leaning groups are going to say, no, it's just it's an indication that black males are heavily discriminated against by America's system of justice. I'd say, I think I could prove that's not true, but I'll bet that's an example of the misinformation that kids are going to be warned about. Say, don't believe these reports that violent crimes are committed predominantly by one small group of people. It's that the system is just picking on that one small group of people because of their skin color. Would that kind of example work?
Yeah, and if you look at the groups who are behind this media literacy education push, and as I did, you chronicle what happens in the conferences that they hold, the speakers they promote, and then the materials that they point to in the way of media literacy education. As I tick through in this story, you have Teach the History of Policing, a resource from the Howard Zinn, that's communist Howard Zinn linked Zinn Education Project. PBS's 3 Ways to Teach the Insurrection at the Capitol, the Insurrection at the Capitol. Education Week's Teaching Math Through a Social Justice Lens. These fall under the guise of, and in terms of the recommended materials from media literacy advocates, these are the very materials that states that have passed these bills list as being reasonable references and resources for teachers to point to. And the broader context for this is very important. And the broader context is that we have a moral panic in this country over mis, dis, and malinformation, so-called. But oftentimes that itself is rooted in mis, dis, and malinformation. Namely, for example, the Trump-Russia collusion narrative, which proved to be false, as well as the overblown idea that Russia interfered in the 2016 election and swung it. And then true stories that our corporate media and our betters in the kind of disinformation industrial complex said was disinformation, but which wasn't. And that's, of course, the Hunter Biden laptop story. and the like. So you have to consider the context for this. And New Jersey's governor made it very clear when he said essentially that media literacy education in New Jersey is effectively about preventing the likes of the violent insurrection, as he called it, in a January 6, 2023 statement 2 days after signing the bill. So the context is these Americans are getting dis, and malinformation on a whole slew of issues, from election integrity through basically anything under the sun. And consequently, we need the schools to go in and police this by arming the kids with the right information or the right worldview so as to not be duped and become potentially domestic terrorists. That's the framing that those like Governor Murphy in New Jersey have used to push these bills. And that in and of itself gives it a political tinge where even if the materials are presented as neutral and the language is neutral, those who are ultimately going to be overseeing its implementation have a political slant to them, and that obviously could play a huge role in the classroom and what kids learn.
Because, for example, right to your point about J6, January 6th, you're told Donald Trump lied and said the 2020 election was stolen. And that's a lie. That's an example of misinformation you'd be taught if you're a kid. You say, well, what about Stacey Abrams? She said her election was stolen, not just one election, but a couple of elections. You say, oh, no, Stacey Abrams, her, words come out of her mouth, and they're the God's honest truth. You say, hold on. So if you say anytime somebody mentions a stolen election, it's a lie, unless it happens to be a prominent Democrat, in which case it's not a lie. And this has got to be really confusing for kids, isn't it?
Well, sure. And of course, teachers and librarians are authority figures. They have disproportionate sway over students. And, one of the things we get to in the story is those who are skeptical of this effort note that before you get to critical thinking and grappling over these ideas, you have to have a base of knowledge, a rootedness in a set of facts, in history and beyond. And to young kids who are going to be presented now with these are the media sources that perhaps you ought to look to, these sources lack in credibility, and here's why. There's an even more basic issue, which is, are they getting a fundamental education that you need before you can ask those sorts of questions and probe and interrogate the sources and who's behind the sources and what's the slant and the like. And, one New Jersey public school teacher, longtime teacher, high school teacher, told me essentially media literacy. What about just literate students? And that's the real question is, do we have even basic education that we need before we get to combating dis, and malinformation based upon how teachers and librarians interpret it?
No, and in fact, I know that there are going to be kids who've heard the 1619 curriculum, that America is an irredeemably racist country based on slavery. And they probably won't hear, for example, that long after the Civil War, or long before the Civil War, when the United States and Great Britain, had a peace treaty after the War of 1812, they said part of that peace treaty is we're going to go out and send our militaries out to try to shut down slavery as a country, and they won't be taught that part because it runs against the narrative, and that is, again, misinformation. You got to read this whole story by Ben Weingarten, who's with Real Clear Investigation. Ben, it's always a pleasure. Glad to get your calls next at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And you're listening to the radio. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Welcome to the Radio Northwest Network. It's honestly provocative talk radio for the Pacific Northwest. And you can certainly join the conversation anytime you like at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. If you're a naysayer, we'll put you first in line. If you want to disagree with me, we'll do it. We'll give you the biggest soapbox in the Pacific Northwest to send out your arguments against my craziness, and I'll just have to ask you a few questions later on. Our Twitter poll today: should Northwest governments pay people not to drive their cars to work one day a week? Do the folks in government really hate automobiles that much that they want to pay people $50 to agree not to drive their car on 8 Wednesdays? That's literally what the city of Portland is doing right now. You can find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by Ultimate Truck Services. If you rely on trucks for business, Ultimate keeps your biggest assets on the road and running right. Find them at ultimatetruckservice.com. Yesterday, I asked you because of Ted Wheeler's comments that, hey, Measure 110, the drug legalization for Oregon that made every kind of hard drug under the sun legal to possess. I said, if it's not working, as feckless Ted finally realizes, should Oregon abandon voter-approved hard drug legalization? Now, of course, in Washington state, hard drug legalization was brought about by the courts, and the legislature has not yet seen fit to restore those laws and maybe restore some order to society. One of the guys who knows that best is Representative Dan Griffey, who's a Republican from Allen, Washington. Hey, Representative Griffey, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you.
Is there any chance, before we get to the pill presses that I want to talk to you or ask you about, is there any chance that the legislature, your Democrat colleagues, are going to go along with the idea of actually restoring some hard drug laws for the state of Washington?
We have an opportunity. We did hear in the Public Safety Committee, the new committee, Community Safety, Justice, and Reentry Committee. We did hear the bill for a full 2 hours. There were some concerns with it. I still have some concerns with it, but it's way better than what we're doing now. I believe if we fund it, we can make a difference. So there is a chance. Let's hope they move that Blake fix, and we'll see.
But even that one only takes it back to a misdemeanor. Am I right?
Gross misdemeanor. So the chance you could spend up to 1 year in the big boy house, but it's something, right? We need to, I think it's about saving lives, and it's about engaging with people when we can. It's also about saving our ways of life and making sure that we isolate our kids and most vulnerable from the things that they're doing. It's not going to get me to where I want to be, but it's going to be a heck of a lot closer to where I want to be, being a gross misdemeanor than nothing.
Yeah, and I know there's a chance of spending time in jail. That's assuming you had a reasonable judiciary and not a far-left judiciary, which sadly the Evergreen State has a far-left judiciary for the most part. I wanted to ask you about this, though, and it may be an issue. As you say, this may be one of the sleeper bills in the session, and it might actually get to the governor's desk. It would make pill presses in the wrong hands a Class C felony. Would you explain, because I find this fascinating, but we've talked about the issue before, why owning something that presses powder into what looks like a pill is something that is so wrong that it ought to be punished by a Class C felony conviction if somebody is caught with one of these pill presses? Why are they so very significant?
Well, it's really tragic, and it comes from a tragic story. But basically, what this can do is industrious monsters have figured out that they can easily transport powder fentanyl, the most addictive substance known to the human being, very easily into the state, and then they can press it using these pill presses into clones of, say, Percocet, Oxycontin, the ADHD medications, and even some Skittles looking shapes. The horrible thing is our kids are getting a hold of it. The most vulnerable in our society are getting a hold of it, and industrious monsters have figured out how they can have if the people that take the pill live through the first time consuming fentanyl, which is not always the case, and most of the time it isn't, that they can have a ready purchasing group of people forever. It's bad because those numbers and lines and all those things that you see on your pharmaceutical drugs are there for FDA reasons. So it sets purity standards. You know that if it comes out with a certain number and a couple dots and a couple lines, you can track it back to that. It has a set purity standard. The problem is these industrious monsters are cloning them. I have a very sad story that I'd like to share, but it is your show, so I'll let you talk.
You please tell people, because this ties right into my thoughts on it, but I want to hear the story.
So a dear friend of mine, Greg Yates, he actually is now the assistant chief of the organization that we came up in, and we were partners for years and years. I knew his son Tyler for a long time. Well, Tyler got in a motorcycle accident, and he had had for years pain control and pain management problems. Washington State and most states have kind of gone, they ignore the few percentage of the population that are still struggling with extreme pain. That's a different policy we got to deal with. So they turn to the black market this dear kid whose life was out in front of him, Tyler Lee Yates, Greg's son, went to a local casino where his girlfriend was working to pick her up, purchased 5 Percocet from somebody he knew, and he took one Percocet, and the video camera shows him slowly going unconscious and then taking his last breath from one pill. The reason, and that's just sad, but in Tyler's name, we've named this bill. It's not my bill, by the way. It's Maury Levitt. So anytime you can find a good Democrat that wants to combat the things you want to combat,
absolutely,
I find that we have to elevate them. And Maury and I teamed up on this bill, and the reason is if you own these devices, there's only one good reason to own it. One, you have an FDA number and you're allowed to own it and make pure, and you follow the purity standards. Or the other is you're deceiving people into taking something that they would not be willing to take and could kill them on the first dose.
And one of the biggest problems is that these drug dealers, these monsters, as you call them, and you're right in calling them that, they say we've got this fentanyl, it's hugely powerful, but when they mix it and say we're going to put a certain amount in each pill, they don't have the accuracy of a real pharmaceutical company, so they may get a little extra in one pill. And the little extra ends up being the lethal overdose that you talked about with Tyler Lee Yates. And making these things illegal to possess. Nobody is going to complain about this because nobody else except drug dealers or pharma companies has a reason to own a pill press that I can think of, although I'm willing to take a naysayer call if somebody says there's some other legitimate use of pill presses. That's Representative Dan Griffey, Republican of Allen. Glad to hear he's got a Democrat on board. Glad to get your calls, too, at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You heard Trump won't be indicted today. I'm going to tell you why that may be never. That's coming up next on the Radio Northwest Network.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Emails to talk@larslarson.com. Tell your Alexa device to play the Lars Larson Show. And I got to tell you something. This whole defund the police movement, I've admitted to you before that I made a colossal mistake last year when I heard people saying, defund the police. And I thought, well, that's not going to happen. And then I had to watch as Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, a lot of other cities said, yeah, we're not going to get rid of funding altogether, but we're going to cut it down by tens or in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars. Los Angeles did that. They actually took an awful lot of the money out of policing, not half, not 50%, not even 25, but just taking that small amount out has meant that major cities, Minneapolis is now rethinking their defund the police nonsense because of the damage that's being done. Rising crime rate, more shootings that are happening, more homicides, that sort of thing. So I thought I'd talk to Lance LaRusso, who is a former cop, attorney, and the author of the books When Cops Kill and Blue News, and he gives the proceeds from those books to police charities. Lance, welcome back to the program, and we're watching an awful lot of cops. I'm hearing about it from some of my police friends who say those that can get out are getting out right now, some of them out of the business altogether. So what should America conclude from that?
You know, this defund the police movement is just, in a word, silly. There's a bottom line that somebody in society, in a peaceful society, has to perform a law enforcement function. And whether that law enforcement function is arresting people who are bad guys or making sure that people aren't driving on the roads when they're DUI or going out and finding Alzheimer's patients who have wandered away from their homes, someone has to do those functions. And say that you're going to defund the police, you're basically reducing the amount of funding for training and specialized training in particular, and also travel for training. Those are the only two, basically discretionary parts of a law enforcement budget are training and travel, which is usually for training. So what's going to wind up happening with all these people who have this incredible idea that know nothing about law enforcement is the end result of a law enforcement agency that is less trained and less able to handle catastrophes that happen to people in that society.
I mean, for example, in Denver, Colorado, they've had 200 law enforcement officials in the state of Colorado who have resigned or retired after the governor enacted sweeping police reforms because they said, if this is where this particular profession is going, I'm not going there with them. And some of them have relocated to other law enforcement agencies. Some of them, I would imagine, are simply getting out because law enforcement officers are talented people. They know how to do more than just what they do on the job in a uniform. And I'm worried that America is going to see a brain drain and an experience drain, where the most experienced, most senior officers closest to retirement are going to leave. And it's going to leave brand new officers behind who don't have that kind of historical knowledge of how to get the job done and done safely and done legally and right.
That's already happening. And in any profession, law enforcement is no exception to this, in any profession, when you have the best and the brightest who are no longer attracted to the profession and leaving at the first opportunity, you're going to have a problem. And as I've said to people, if you don't like law enforcement now, you're really going to hate the second string. Because at some point, these politicians that are screaming and hollering about law enforcement are going to get a backlash, and they're going to have to hire someone. Part of what you're seeing in Colorado and other places, Connecticut and other jurisdictions that have pushed for an end to qualified immunity, is a lot of these law enforcement officers are saying, look, if there's going to be people coming directly after me, I'm just out of the profession. And the absolute abject lies that are being told about qualified immunity are just beyond the pale.
By the way,
if a law enforcement
I know what it is, Lance. I know what it is, Lance, but let my audience know what qualified immunity, how does that translate in the life of a cop?
Sure. So qualified immunity is immunity that is afforded from civil liability, not criminal. It's afforded civil liability for all public officials. Your dog catcher, the person who does the surveys, the person who sits on the zoning board, they all have the same qualified immunity. The number one thing that they have to have in order to qualify for qualified immunity and get immunity from civil suits is they have to be acting within the law. So this notion that an officer commits murder and then they can't be sued and the government can't be sued is absolute nonsense. Because if they commit a crime, it's outside the course and scope of their employment, and they are not entitled to qualified immunity as a matter of law. Further, the other issue that is just an absolute lie is that these egregious cases that we hear of, qualified immunity prevented people from recovering. If you look at cases like Laquan McDonald, if you look at cases where officers were convicted of crimes, there was no qualified immunity at play because in several of those cases, the family never filed suit. The case was settled before the family ever filed suit. So you have a bunch of people out here saying qualified immunity is keeping people out of court, and it's just not true. We did a survey of 252 appellate court cases, and law enforcement officers received qualified immunity in 53% of them, 53, so a little bit over half. And then the other thing that people are lying about is it's not an absolute blanket immunity. Courts look at the conduct of the officers, and they can say, for instance, in an actual case, 2 of the taser deployments were justified, so you get qualified immunity for those.
Yep.
The third one was not, and you're going to a jury.
And that's reasonable. And in fact, the thing I find the craziest about this, Lance, is that the people who are talking about changing the laws, they're almost all Democrat politicians in state legislatures, are themselves the beneficiaries of qualified immunity. In other words, if you say you changed a law and you caused some harm to me, or you ruled against the zoning, as you said, your local zoning board, and you damaged me, and then later on we found out you shouldn't have done that, they get qualified immunity because they were acting within the scope of what it is they're elected to do or appointed or hired to do. So they get some protection. I wish if these people were going to say we're going to take away qualified immunity from cops, fine. Let's take it away from all government officials, hired or elected.
Well, in Connecticut, it's even worse because in Connecticut, they carved out law enforcement and kept qualified immunity intact. Here's the other part of this that people miss. You have to be performing a discretionary act. So let's say if there's a must act, like let's say a law enforcement officer checking someone into a prison, they have to make sure that they have medication. They get screened by a physician. If you fail to perform a ministerial act, you don't get qualified immunity. So qualified immunity is reserved for the situations where the officer's knowledge, training, skill, and experience force them to make a split-second decision under, as the United States Supreme Court called, rapidly evolving, dangerous circumstances. And in those situations, the courts have said we understand those functions have to be performed, and if the officers are making good decisions that are consistent with what the prevailing law is, and they didn't commit a criminal act, then we're going to give them qualified immunity.
Absolutely. That's Lance LaRusso, former cop, the author of When Cops Kill and Blue News, and he gives the proceeds from those books to police charities. Glad to be with you on a Tuesday night. Glad to take your emails. Talk at LarsLarson.com.
Lars Larson. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I often think when I see Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano on Fox News or other television programs, I think, they don't appreciate him enough, and they don't give him enough time to talk about the things that he is so knowledgeable about. An expert in national security and foreign policy challenges with the Heritage Foundation. Colonel Carafano, welcome back to the program.
Hey, it's a real honor to be on with you.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. So tell me what we should make of these meetings between President Putin and President Xi, a couple of dictators, and what are they up to at this point, and what should America be doing about this? And is this really positioning the Chinese communists to essentially become, well, if not the owners and the operators of Russia, at least having a wholly owned interest in that country?
Yeah. So I can't get this movie out of my head, the one that won all the Oscars everywhere, all the time, everything, whatever it's called. But I feel like it's the same thing. It's like we're living in parallel universes here. From the Russian perspective, Putin runs around Mariupol like he's a liberating hero. He scoffs at being indicted. He meets with Xi, and they talk about basically conquering the world. But the reality is that he's in a very weak position. The war has not gone well, and every day they fight, his forces are actually worse off than they were the day before. So he is definitely the junior, weaker partner here. And he really craves the Chinese support because, honestly, it's all he has. But, the Chinese, they don't do anything for nothing, and they don't stick their neck out for anybody. So, he knows he's getting a bad deal. But this is the poison chalice that he's chosen. The Chinese perspective, look, they're like James Bond at the roulette table. They're just covering all the bets. So on the one hand, they'd love for the Russians to win because that's what actually puts them in best set, humiliates the United States, it weakens and divides Western Europe, it creates opportunities for China. But they're not going to really risk anything for the Russians. That's just not the way the Chinese do these things. So on the other hand, what's the worst can happen if the Russians fold like a cheap state? The Chinese will just supplant their interests in all over the world, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Central Asia. Maybe they'll even wind up picking up, part of Russia. So, from the Chinese perspective, is they're planning for any possible outcome. But this gets to the really crucial question of, well, what do we do about this? And the answer is, on the one hand, you want Russia to be as poor and weak a partner for China as they possibly can be. You want them to really be a burden rather than an asset. And honestly, every day Putin continues to fight this war, he is a lesser threat to the West. His conventional forces are less threat than they were the day before. So continuing to support Ukraine, it really isn't our interest. In the long run, we're actually going to be better off because the Europeans will do a lot more to defend themselves. We'll have to have a lot less force and attention in Western Europe. We're going to save a ton of money in the long run, so we'll be better off. But on the other side of this is we have to recognize that the Chinese brand is down. I mean, not just with Europeans who see how feckless they are, but many other countries as well. And so the weakness of Russia and the kind of bad blood people really have for the Chinese really creates enormous opportunities for the United States. Unfortunately, the problem is we don't really have a president that really knows how to maximally take advantage of either situation. We just have the wrong president for this war, I'm afraid.
I'm talking to Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano, who's an expert in national security. So let me ask you this, though. The Chinese get something else you didn't mention. To some extent, they're weakening our conventional forces as well. And, Colonel, am I right to pay attention to those reports from some of our own people who are saying we can't keep up with the extent to which we're exhausting some of our resources, both financial and military?
Well, no. Well, from the financial side, look, what's exhausting our resources is $6 trillion of debt from the Biden administration,
Agreed.
not the war in Ukraine. Matter of fact, we just ran the numbers the other day. The reports on our website. Biden's open border policies cost the American taxpayer more than the entire support that we've given to Ukraine. The fraud, if you add up all the fraud and all the big programs that Biden has spent, that's actually more money to Ukraine. So it seems like big bucks until you put it up against everything else Biden is spending and the disastrous impact that's had on the economy. That's the fiscal problem, not the war. On the munitions side is we are sending a lot of munitions and things to Ukraine, but those are not the kinds of things that deter China or that would be used to deter China. I mean, for example, we send a lot of artillery. The Indo-Pacific is largely a naval theater, so it's really about ships and missiles and airplanes, not artillery shells and tanks. And the flip side of that, it's actually been a wake-up call. I think people have realized that we have really we've neglected sustained investment in defense that we really need. And we need to figure out how to really get our shipbuilding program into the game. And that has nothing to do with Ukraine. So if anything, I think this has been a wake-up call. I mean, it's also been a reminder of, again, how really a feckless president we have. He's done a very good job maintaining bipartisan support for Ukraine. He's done a terrible job explaining what we're doing, why we're there, how we're going to leverage all this. He's very tepid in dealing with the Chinese. He's turned in anemic defense budgets 3 years in a row. Our real enemy here is not our enemy, but our real problem here is in the White House, not in Beijing or Moscow.
Well, let me ask you about this, because I think that Biden is compromised to China because of all those business deals that his son made, which benefited the Biden crime family. But we're way behind in our commitments that we've made to Taiwan. And wouldn't it be cheaper to deter China there by supplying the arms we've already agreed to give to Taiwan so China never takes the move toward Taiwan? And is Ukraine retarding our ability to fulfill the commitments we made years ago to Taiwan?
Well, no, I mean, it's different capabilities. And also the Taiwanese are buying these things. It's not. No,
I understand they're paying the bill, and I've had to straighten some people out on that. I've said we're not giving it to them. They're buying this stuff, but we're behind in delivery. And I understand it's different munitions, but is Ukraine and are the commitments we're making there holding back our ability to fulfill those commitments that might well hold off China from taking action against Taiwan?
Well, I think the short answer is no. And I don't think you can kind of bifurcate saying, that Ukraine is restraining us. In many ways, the Chinese look at how the West and the United States reacted to Ukraine, and then they have to ask themselves, would the world just turn a blind eye if we tried something in Taiwan, or would the U.S. respond there? So I do think it kind of gives them a call. And people tend to negate, how easy it would be to take one. If you look at every major war game that we've ever done, it's 100 miles of ocean that they got to cross. They can get there. They can even fight their way ashore. But I haven't seen a war game yet that says the Chinese can easily take Taiwan if the Taiwanese fight back. And if countries like the United States and others step in and threaten the logistical lines, then the Chinese can get there, but they can't win. So I think right now, China's more worried about having a Ukraine and Taiwan if they tried something than anything else. But this is, like I said, you're exactly right. This is a big wake-up call for the United States. And we just have a president that isn't up to it. Now, is he compromised, or is he just completely incompetent? I got to tell you, I don't know how we would know the difference. Think about this, right? The reason why China is in the position it is today is it made this aggressive and successful move in the South China Seas with almost zero opposition from the United States.
Yep.
Now, when did that occur? That occurred when everybody that is in the White House now was in the White House.
Yep. And I guess the reason I say he's compromised is while we're worrying about this, what is Joe Biden doing? He's saying, well, our energy future is to shut down all the coal plants that we have in abundance and that China is building to beat the band, and buy hundreds of billions of dollars of windmills and solar panels from who? From China, who's aiding and abetting Russia. I mean, if you're buying stuff from the folks who are your biggest competitor on the planet and who are aiding and abetting Russia, it really does make me feel that Joe Biden is compromised because we shouldn't be doing business. We should do as little business with them as we possibly can. That's Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation. Colonel, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. If you want to jump in to the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Less than half a mile from where I'm standing right now is one of America's biggest rivers. It's called the Columbia River. And I always like to remind people, I've never heard anybody else say it, but I say about 2 days after that water in the river goes past where I'm standing right now, it becomes the most plentiful and useless substance on earth. It becomes salt water. And at any given moment, less than 2% of all the water on planet Earth, water we absolutely have to live, is fresh water. The other 98% plus is salt water. And so when I saw Susan Shelley's columns, she's an editorial writer for the Southern California News Group, writing about the fact that we are missing a tremendous opportunity to hang on to some of the water that falls at this time of the year, so that places that are notoriously short of water, but they're only short because they don't decide to hang on to the stuff that's falling out of the sky right now. On that note, Susan Shelley joins me now. Susan, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so very much.
Thank you, Lars. It's great to be with you.
Well, I got to tell you something. Your columns really hit home with me because almost all the states that are short of water are only short some parts of the year. And you say, well, why don't they hang on to the water? And about a month ago, I saw a number that said that the state you live in, California, if they had merely hung on to the water that fell just in January of this year, when there were some notoriously extensive rains during that time, they'd be out of drought trouble maybe for the next decade. But the state can't hang on to it, even though money's been set aside to do exactly that. Would you mind giving my audience your perspective on this?
Sure. Well, the rain that fell in January, 95% of it was flushed out to the ocean because of an environmental regulation. I believe it was an executive order that Governor Gavin Newsom signed in 2019 that said when rain fell between this date in December and this date in January, they would not run the pumps on the Delta. We have two huge water projects that were built in the 1930s and the 1960s to move water down to the farms and the cities, and they have throttled them because of lawsuits over endangered species or threatened species or just species that have lawyered up and arranged settlements for themselves. So that was the reason it was all flushed out in January. But what has just happened is our reservoirs are too full, and water was released all weekend from Lake Oroville, which is the largest storage facility in the State Water Project, 35,000 cubic feet per second released to the ocean. That's enough water in 8 hours to supply up to 48,000 households for a year. And they flushed it out to the ocean because there was no place to store it. And they have to lower the reservoir for flood control because it's going to rain again. And the snow is going to melt, and they can't take a chance on flooding the whole region. So they lowered the reservoir. Why don't we have water storage? In 2014, the voters of California approved nearly $3 billion to build water storage, and 9 years later, not one project has been built.
And the reason is what? More lawsuits from greenies?
Oh, the reason, it breaks my heart to say it, the reason is the language of the bond measure said that all the projects approved for this money had to have public benefits in order to qualify for the money. And the public benefits are listed as recreation, bird habitat, flood control, water quality. You know what's not considered a public benefit?
What?
Water storage.
What?
Water storage is not a public benefit. It's not a public benefit. So just providing water storage does not qualify for funding. Water storage is considered in California a private benefit, and therefore the water agencies or the local governments have to raise half the funding for the project. And 9 years later, all we have to show for what would be 6 water storage projects, all we have to show for it is a lot of environmental documentation and permitting requirements and reports to the state saying the whole thing is still on time. I kid you not, 9 years, nothing built, and they think it's on time.
Now, Susan, I'm talking to Susan Shelley. She writes columns for the Southern California News Group. So let me guess that the reason you have to dig into the language of the bill and do some interpretation is because somebody either took this to court or threatened to take it to court saying, you sold this to the taxpayers as money for water storage, but now we're not allowed to spend the money on water storage because of the technical language of the bond?
Nobody even had to go to court. It was just in the fine print. I think what happened is many lawmakers did not want to build water storage because environmental activists don't like water storage. They think the whole state should be natural, and if we die, we die. That's kind of their viewpoint. And because of this political influence in Sacramento, there is a lot of pressure not to build dams, reservoirs, water infrastructure, and not to use the water infrastructure that we've already built and paid for. So it's very frustrating. They put it in the bond in order to get the votes they needed to get the thing on the ballot and get voter approval. And then they had this sort of poison pill in the language, which I don't think anyone understood at the time, that would have effectively prevented from ever being built.
Now, Susan, you live in the L.A. basin, don't you, or somewhere near there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's where I am. I'm in Los Angeles.
If they want it to be natural, isn't the L.A. basin, I mean, wasn't it long before Disney, long before even the orange groves? It was naturally pretty much desert, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's technically considered a Mediterranean climate. We do get rain, but we don't get it all the time. We have dry years and we have wet years. The LA River used to flood. It used to be natural. And in the 1920s, it would flood and it would kill people. And in the 1930s, it would flood and it would kill people. And the Army Corps of Engineers came in after, I think it was the 1938 flood, which was particularly bad, and they channeled the river in concrete. So now when it rains, because we're a basin and the water comes down from the mountains all at once, and the river goes where it feels like going if it's not channeled. So now it's channeled in concrete. So what do you think the city government wants to do in Los Angeles? They want to jackhammer the concrete and let the river be natural. They're out of their minds. They're out of their minds. They think they're going to build apartment buildings that will be waterfront property. Don't buy anything below the 5th floor.
No kidding. Well, Susan, but if they want natural, then why don't we say, okay, we'll give the LA basin natural. You'll be dry most of the time. It'll be dry and brown, and that'll be it. And then every once in a while, a giant killer flood will come along and wipe out part of the population. If that's what they want, LA's got the population. Tell Sacramento, we want to go back to killer floods and killer dry the rest of the time. You guys can be natural. The rest of us are going to be sensible. Would they go for that?
I don't know. You mentioned the Columbia River. You know, in the 1940s, we had a drought for several years, and it was however long it has to be for people to say, wow, we have to do something about this. And there was actually a plan that was drafted, an engineering plan to channel some of the Columbia River down to Southern California. But then it rained and everybody forgot about it. I think that plan is still in the drawer someplace. We could look for it.
Well, we could, or the state of California could go back to the days of Pat Brown, because I remind people of that. I lived in L.A. when I was a little teeny kid. I went to kindergarten in Inglewood, but didn't he have about 25 or 30 water projects only on the drawing board but ready to go until the environmentalists killed them? And you could store, those things would have stored more than enough water to carry all of California through all of the droughts. Am I wrong?
Absolutely. You are absolutely right. In fact, I was reading a biography of Governor Pat Brown not too long ago, and I believe it was one of his grandsons who became an environmentalist and shamed his grandfather out of building a dam project that was on the drawing board. So this has been coming for a long time, but Governor Pat Brown was someone who got it done, and he believed in infrastructure. And unfortunately, when you build infrastructure, the next generation takes it for granted, and then they start to think that the solution to the problem is a problem. And the next thing you know, they're causing a new set of problems, which earlier generations solved for us.
You got to check out these columns by Susan Shelley from the Southern California News Group. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
That makes a lot of sense, a lot of nonsense.
Right, you're bloody well right. You know you got a right to say.
This is the Northwest Nonsense.
How much longer do we have to sit for this nonsense?
No left-leaning, dead fish wrapper bias. No mega TV network liberal agenda. Just the cold, hard facts from Lars.
I expect that this is going to ring very true if you think about it. The folks in government here in the Northwest are constantly reminding us how we should prepare for emergencies, prepare for earthquakes, prepare for tsunamis, for storms, and all the rest.
Well, how well do you take preparation advice from folks who do such a lousy job of it themselves? Usually, if I'm looking for advice, I ask somebody who actually does that thing well, not somebody who does it badly. Take Clackamas County, for example. County Chair Tootie Smith, a friend of myself and the show, and she's a Republican as well. She joined me yesterday on the talk show. You might have heard the interview with her. If you didn't, it's posted at larslarson.com. So Tootie Smith pointed out that the county is now in its third emergency in the space of 12 months. So how have they done? Well, the generator that backs up power for their emergency operations center failed. Apparently somebody didn't maintain it well, and certainly somebody didn't test it well. And the generators that power the sewage treatment plant, to keep human waste out of the rivers, that thing ran out of fuel. And apparently they didn't have a backup plan for finding more fuel. A private company would get massive fines for that kind of thing, dumping sewage in the river. Government, well, they managed to escape all those fines. The radio station that serves as the flagship for my syndicated programs, FM News 101 KXL, we have emergency generators as well, and they have been in use, heavy use, this past week. They have plenty of fuel and plans for getting more during an emergency that goes on longer than expected. Those plans have been in place for decades, no matter what the emergency happens to be. The government, not so very much. But you understand why this kind of thing happens. You see, if KXL or any one of our Radio Northwest affiliates fails to serve the public, especially during an emergency like this, the FCC has some serious consequences for that station. And if our engineers let the radio station go off the air, there would be consequences for them, personally likely. And stations that don't run advertising when everyone is listening, well, they lose money. And private companies can't afford to lose money. Not very much. Government loses money all day long and twice on Sunday. So County Chair Tootie Smith told me yesterday she doesn't know why they ran out of fuel. She doesn't know why they failed to arrange for more or arrange for instances where they might need more. And she admits that even when they find out who failed in that way so miserably, nobody is going to get fired or punished or demoted. I can tell you it doesn't work that way in the private sector. From Facebook, Brian Hogan writes, and Lars, my point, when a substation blew up in Beaverton a few years ago, Intel had backup generators. The caveat is they only had fuel for X amount of hours. If their production machines went powerless, it would have been several $1 million per machine to recalibrate. Intel had standby contracts with fuel suppliers for replenishment. Expensive, but cheaper than the alternative. Long time, second time, signed Brian. And now today's Daily Grill.
Insane.
Are you completely insane?
Ridiculous.
They get more and more ridiculous.
Flat out dumb.
You're even dumber than I thought.
Who deserves today's Lars Grill of the Day?
Maybe they're just really, really stupid.
Find out right now. Brought to you by Les Schwab Tire Centers. Doing the right thing matters.
Well, I'm going to award the Daily Grill to the Department of Transportation. It might be the Oregon Department of Transportation. It might be WashDOT because they share responsibilities for the 205 freeway bridge. I think they made it even more dangerous than it had to be. And I'm going to cite this specific example. Just today, we've seen the identification of Antonio Lopez Amaro, 57-year-old man whose car, believe it or not, went off the side of the 205 bridge into the Columbia River. It happened on Sunday night. It was terrible weather conditions at that point. But you know what made it worse? And it got me thinking about the last time that a car went over the side of that bridge. I think it was close to 20 years ago. In fact, I can't find any mention of it on the internet, but I remember covering it as a reporter. I remember going out to the bridge the day the accident, within an hour of when the accident happened. And you wonder, well, how does a car, even at freeway speeds, end up going over the Jersey barrier that's the side barrier on the side of a bridge that's, 100 feet or better off the river? Because a fall to water from 100 feet, that's like falling on concrete. And sadly, it took the life of Antonio Lopez Amaro. Why was his rig sliding out of control, but why did it go over the side? Well, I can tell you that I drove over the bridge last night, and we heard reports the very first day, although it seems that most of the reporters from the Daily Dead fish wrapper newspapers and most of the TV stations are incredibly incurious about this. They're not going to ODOT. I went to ODOT, and I said, listen, will you come on or have somebody come on and talk about this? Apparently, their snow plows plowed over the bridge. And where did they put the excess snow? They put it on the side.
Now, that normally works very well on a road on dry land. On a bridge, what it does is it builds a ramp in front of that barrier. So when Mr. Amaro's vehicle, spinning out of control, hit that snow ramp and was lofted up and over the barrier to a fatal ending in the Columbia River, it happened because they didn't bother to snowplow all that snow off the bridge. As I said, I think this was a mistake where ODOT or WashDOT, perhaps even the city of Vancouver and city of Portland, made that bridge a lot more dangerous than it had to be. If you're going to plow the snow at all, plow it either toward the center of the bridge or plow it all the way off of the bridge. In this case, I think that Mr. Lopez Amaro's family is probably going to have a cause of action against governments that made that bridge too dangerous, more dangerous than it was without the plowing. Today's best email, but you can always send more to talk@LarsLarson.com. Brought to you by Quinault Casino. Quinault Casino, winners happen here. Englewood Market. Guy at Englewood Market wrote to me and said, Lars, as a lottery retailer, I get to see a small amount of the revenue the state makes with their legalized monopoly. In these difficult times in our state's forgiving attitude toward the chosen, I think the state should take lottery funds to help the bars and restaurants that had to close. I'm not looking for anything as I've been open. I also think recreational hunter fines should be dropped, not for the loss of time to hunt if you're hunting illegally. The state likes to let a lot of people walk away without paying. Recreational hunters are a target for state revenue every year. I appreciated your tribute to Rush yesterday. Have a great day. Well, thank you very much for the email. Send those emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And let me go first to a naysayer. Let's go first to Michael. Hey, Michael, I've got two naysayers. Welcome to the program. What do you and I disagree about today?
Hey, Lars, appreciate you so much. From what I understand, talking to PG this morning because I'm out of power, is that the transmission lines can't be buried underground for some technical reason. I didn't get that reason from them, but they told me that a lot of the lines can't be underground.
Yeah, a lot of them cannot. But, Michael, can I tell you something? PGE and other utilities have said they already have about half their lines underground. And I'm not suggesting the undergrounding of all lines. What you do is you look at the places where the lines are most likely to be broken by trees or broken by some other cause, and then you protect those lines. Glad to be with you. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.